as most forgotten stories do, with the ground giving up what it had once chosen to keep. In the spring of 1914, on the outskirts of a small Kansas town no one speaks of anymore, a farmer's plow struck something solid beneath the soft soil. He expected a stone, maybe a buried fence post, but what surfaced instead was white, curved, and unmistakably human. A bone. The field was quiet then, only the wind scraping over the wheat and the distant creak of a windmill turning toward the sky. The farmer stared at the object half buried in dirt, his hands trembling not from fear, but from the strange understanding that the land beneath him was not empty. It had been hiding something. By evening, word had spread. The sheriff rode out, the town doctor followed, and a handful of neighbors gathered along the fence line, whispering into their collars. They said the farm had always felt wrong, too still, too far from the main road, too silent even for Kansas. When the plow struck that first bone, it was as if the silence had broken. And once it broke, it wouldn't stop. In the days that followed, more bones were found. A ribcage, a jaw, fragments of a skull. The remains were old, bleached, and fragile, as though the earth had been grinding them down for decades. There were no markers, no graves, no crosses. Just bones, tangled in roots, lying beneath the wheat like the memory of something the town had tried to forget. The newspapers called it the Bone Farm of Kansas. But that name came later, when reporters began to arrive by train, carrying notebooks and cameras that could never quite capture the emptiness of the place. At first, it was just a rumor, spoken in low tones at the general store or murmured at the church after Sunday service. People wondered who had been buried there and why. Some said it was a family, murdered long ago. Others claimed it was the resting place of migrants lost during a drought. A few whispered of older things, settlers, wars, and curses born from blood spilled on stolen land. No one could agree, but everyone felt it. The air around the farm carried a heaviness, the kind that made animals uneasy and men unwilling to work the fields alone. Even those who did not believe in ghosts admitted that something lingered there. When night fell, locals said they could hear sounds drifting from the property, soft voices, sometimes laughter, sometimes weeping. The kind of sounds that don't belong to the living. Those who lived closest swore they'd seen a faint light in the barn, even when the place stood abandoned. Others claimed the well near the back pasture never ran dry, no matter how long the drought lasted. They said it was fed by something deeper than water. The farmer who found the first bone stopped sleeping soon after. His wife said he'd wake in the night, sit up straight, and stare toward the window that faced the field. When she asked what he saw, he would only whisper, "They're still out there." But the real mystery wasn't in the sounds or the lights. It was in the timeline. The bones didn't match the story the land was supposed to tell. They were far older than the farmhouse, older even than the first survey records of the area. And yet, some were shockingly well preserved, as if the earth itself had kept them close. Scientists from Topeka came to examine them. They spoke of mineral deposits, preservation conditions, soil density, words meant to make sense of something senseless. But the locals weren't convinced. They said the land wasn't giving up the bones. It was returning them. By midsummer, the farm had been abandoned. The family vanished quietly, leaving dishes on the table, laundry half hung on the line. No one saw them leave, and no one came looking for them. The sheriff posted a notice, "Property vacant. Trespassers will be prosecuted." But even he avoided the road that led to the farm. Years later, travelers still found their way there. Reporters, wanderers, college students chasing a story. Some took soil samples. Others camped near the barn. Few stayed through the night. They all described the same thing, the sound of faint voices, like someone speaking from far beneath the ground. And always, that feeling, that the land was listening. The photographs taken in 1914 remain locked away in archives, grainy and sun-bleached. You can barely make out the outlines of what was found. A skeletal hand curled toward the sky, the remnants of a dress tangled in roots, and something else, something the camera barely caught. A pattern of circular marks pressed into the dirt, as if something had been arranged there long ago. No one ever figured out what they meant. Some said it was ritual. Others thought it was a burial ground older than the town itself. Whatever truth lay beneath that Kansas field, it stayed buried with the bones and the people who had once walked above them. And so the story begins, not with death, but with discovery. A simple act of turning the soil that revealed what should have remained hidden. Because in that year, on that lonely farm, the earth remembered. And it chose, for reasons no one understood, to speak again. Kansas, in the early 1900s, was a land suspended between the old world and the new. It was a state defined by its stillness, flat horizons stretching endlessly in all directions, where the line between sky and soil seemed almost imaginary. In 1914, most of rural Kansas lived by the rhythm of the seasons, plowing, sowing, harvesting, and praying that the rain would come. Towns were small, close-knit, and deeply private. Outsiders were noticed. Secrets were not easily shared. The early years of the century brought both promise and exhaustion. The railroad had carved its steel veins through the heartland, but progress arrived unevenly. While the eastern cities of the state were growing, the countryside lagged behind, isolated farms often standing miles apart, connected only by dusty roads and the faint hum of telegraph lines. Life was slow but not simple. Every family worked to survive the next drought, the next storm, the next winter that might freeze the crops before they could be stored. In such places, belief and superstition lived side by side. The people of Kansas were not quick to fear, but they respected the land, and the land demanded respect. It gave life, and it took it back. There were stories passed down through generations, tales of blizzards that erased entire settlements, of tornadoes that seemed to follow families like curses. The prairie had its own religion, one that blended scripture with soil. When the Great Plains were first settled, graves were often shallow. Families buried their dead on their property, marking the sites with wood that weathered quickly under the wind. In time, markers vanished. Livestock trampled the soft ground. New owners came, unaware of what slept beneath the surface. It wasn't unusual for plows to strike remnants of those forgotten burials, buttons, rings, bits of bone polished by decades of shifting earth. But what was found in 1914 was different. The bones discovered on that farm were not the kind that could be explained away as an old pioneer cemetery. They were too numerous, too scattered, too deliberate. The remains were found in a pattern, as if placed, not lost. When investigators from Topeka arrived, they noted that the bones appeared in clusters of 3 and 4, each about the same distance apart. It was as though someone had divided the field into a grid, a silent geometry etched beneath the crops. At that time, Kansas had a complicated relationship with its own history. It was a state built on conflict. Bleeding Kansas, they called it before the Civil War, when men fought and died over the question of slavery. In the decades that followed, violence became something the land seemed to remember. From outlaw gangs to missing travelers, from disputes that ended with quiet burials in the prairie grass, death had long been a local currency. The soil was thick with stories. By 1914, those stories had started to fade. America was entering modernity. Electricity was reaching rural towns. Automobiles, though rare, began to appear on the main roads. Yet for every sign of progress, there was a shadow of the past still clinging to the edges of these farmlands. Old homesteads decayed where no one lived. Wells went dry and were left open, their dark mouths swallowing birds and small animals. Fields once plowed by families were overtaken by weeds, the wind whispering through them like faint voices. The discovery of bones, then, struck at something primal. It wasn't just about what was found, it was about what it implied. For the people of Kansas, the land was sacred. To find human remains within it without explanation felt like a betrayal, as if the soil itself had turned against them. Local newspapers handled the story cautiously. The Emporia Gazette printed a single paragraph. Remains of indeterminate age were uncovered by a farmer near Wilson County. Authorities suspect they may belong to early settlers. But in private letters and church sermons, the tone was different. People spoke of sin, of punishment, of the old debts the earth was collecting. It didn't help that 1914 was a year of unease. War had erupted in Europe, and though America had not yet joined, its echo was already felt across the plains. Prices of goods were rising, and rumors spread faster than the telegraph could correct them. Fear hung in the air, not the sharp kind that makes people scream, but the slow, heavy kind that settles in the gut. Within this atmosphere of uncertainty, the farm took on a new meaning. It became less a place and more a symbol. People saw in it whatever they feared most: the collapse of faith, the loss of control, the return of something long buried. Some said the bones were the remnants of a forgotten epidemic, cholera perhaps, or smallpox, diseases that once swept through settlements and forced quick, unmarked burials. But the doctors who examined the remains found no clear evidence of disease. The bones bore marks, clean, sharp lines, consistent with tools, not illness. Others turned to folklore. The region had its share of stories about frontier justice, bandits caught and executed without trial, their bodies hidden where they would never be found. In those days, law often traveled slower than rumor. A few locals even spoke of older legends before the white settlers came, tales of sacred burial mounds disturbed by those who did not understand their purpose. To them, the bones were not victims but warnings. By the time state officials arrived, the farm had become a spectacle. Reporters came to sketch the site, and photographers posed near the pit, smiling stiffly as if documenting an archaeological dig. But the air told a different story. Those who visited described a strange stillness. No birds, no crickets, no rustle of wheat. Even the wind seemed to pass over the farm without touching it. It's difficult today to imagine how isolated those communities were. A farm like that could stand for miles in every direction without another house in sight. There were no streetlights, no phones, no constant hum of engines. Nights were long and dark and filled with sounds that modern ears would not recognize. The shifting of wooden boards, the distant howling of coyotes, and the subtle creaks of the house itself, as if it were breathing when bones were found. The people didn't need to see ghosts to feel haunted. They already lived in a world that blurred the line between the living and the dead. The cultural divide between faith and science was widening at the time. The church insisted that such discoveries were tests, reminders that man could not uncover the past without consequence. The scientists from the university argued otherwise, framing it as evidence of forgotten lives, part of the natural cycle of human history. But neither side could explain why, when night fell over that Kansas field, people swore they could hear voices. It wasn't hysteria. It was the way the air carried sound. Flat land has a way of stretching whispers across miles. Or perhaps it was the mind, filling silence with memory. Whatever it was, it persisted. Travelers passing along the dirt road said they felt as though the ground was breathing beneath them, as though every footstep pressed on something aware. In time, the town stopped talking about it. The reports dwindled, the visitors moved on, and the story slipped back into the soil. But the farm remained, its fields overgrown, its barn collapsing inward, its fences leaning like weary sentinels. By the 1920s, no one lived there anymore. Only the wind and the ghosts of wheat moving in the night. Yet even now, the story of that farm endures in fragments, in letters, old articles, and the occasional photograph kept in family albums with no explanation. For those who still remember, the farm is more than a mystery. It's a reminder of how thin the veil can be between what is buried and what refuses to stay that way. The first discovery of bones was almost accidental, a result of the simple act of plowing the earth. The farmer, whose name would later vanish from records, had been preparing his field for planting. The soil was dry, cracked from a long winter, yet stubbornly yielding under the weight of his plow. When the iron blade struck something dense beneath the surface, he assumed it was a rock. But the way it gave a hollow, sickly sound made him pause. Kneeling, he brushed away the soil and revealed the first piece. A human skull, teeth intact, eye sockets empty and staring. No one expected the next week to be worse. As he returned to plowing, the plow struck another object, a femur cracked in two. The soil, it seemed, had become a trapdoor to a past that refused to stay buried. Each turn of the blade revealed another piece, as if the earth itself had decided to confess. By mid-April, the field had become a macabre puzzle, with bones protruding like puzzle pieces that refused to fit together. The neighbors were the first witnesses. They came cautiously, standing at the edges of the field, whispering prayers to themselves. One woman clutched a Bible to her chest, muttering verses she barely understood. Children were kept indoors. The adults whispered of curses and punishment, of sins long forgotten but still owed. When the sheriff arrived, he brought no tools, only a notebook, recording the discoveries without touching the remains. The town doctor examined the bones with gloved hands, murmuring terms like post-mortem, decomposition, and trauma. Yet even he could not explain why some bones seemed older than others. and why the soil preserved some so perfectly while leaving others weathered and fragile. It was on the third day that the first real horror appeared. As the farmer bent over the soil, he felt the plow strike something different, heavier, sharper. Pulling back the soil, he uncovered a small pile, the bones of a child, carefully placed in what appeared to be a rough cradle of roots. The skull was tilted, the jaw slightly open, almost as if the child had been trying to scream. The farmer stepped back, a cold sweat running down his spine. His hands shook. The neighbors had arrived by then, peering over his shoulders. No one spoke, no one moved. The field held them in silent agreement. This was no accident. Over the next week, discoveries became more organized, unnerving in their pattern. Clusters of bones appeared at regular intervals, some forming circles, others scattered as if tossed in frustration. Sharp marks on several bones suggested tools had been used, not for excavation, but possibly for a darker purpose. A rib cage had a clean split down the center. The sheriff noted that the marks were consistent, precise, and impossible to ignore. Even the most skeptical onlookers whispered among themselves, what could have done this, and why? On the fourth day, the first violent incident occurred. The farmer's ox, tethered nearby, suddenly bolted, spooking the man and causing him to fall into the freshly turned soil. He landed hard, the wind knocked from his lungs, and his fingers scraped against something hard. Brushing away the dirt, he found a small knife, rusted but sharp, buried alongside a pelvis. The presence of the knife confused and terrified him. It suggested intentionality. Someone had placed objects among the bones, or perhaps someone had disturbed the site decades earlier, leaving these remnants behind. The nights brought another layer of horror. When the sun dipped below the horizon, neighbors reported hearing faint scraping and whispers from the field, though no one admitted to being there. One man said he awoke to the sound of a child's laughter, thin and echoing, coming from the barn. Another reported hearing a woman's sobs in the wind, though the farm had long been abandoned by anyone living. Animals refused to enter the field at dusk. Dogs howled from a distance and horses trembled, refusing to eat near the soil where bones were discovered. The local doctor, called to examine one of the deeper pits, recounted an unnerving detail. He felt sudden vertigo when leaning over the excavation, as if the ground itself shifted beneath me, he wrote later. Others described cold spots, localized areas where frost formed on the soil even in the spring sun. By now, it was clear to the town that the farm had become a locus of something unnatural. A separate incident involved the barn. When a local journalist attempted to photograph the field at night, the camera malfunctioned repeatedly, its film exposed, the shutter freezing mid-click. The journalist returned the next day to check, finding the barn door slightly ajar, though he had locked it the previous evening. Inside, he discovered a pile of bones stacked neatly in a corner, fragments not previously unearthed. The smell of earth and decay was overpowering, yet no animal or rodent could account for the organization. As days passed, more bone fragments were found in patterns that defied logic. One observer noted 3 femurs arranged like a tripod, a skull balanced atop them, facing the sunrise. The town children, warned not to approach, dared each other to peer over the fence. Some swore they saw shadows moving among the wheat as if the bones themselves were shifting at night. Others claimed the whispers grew louder when no wind blew. Even attempts to map the site revealed nothing consistent. The bones appeared and disappeared in clusters, sometimes uncovered in the same area multiple times, despite careful excavation and documentation. Scientific observers struggled to provide any natural explanation. Soil analysis, radiocarbon dating, even ground-penetrating devices revealed only anomalies. Soil layers inconsistent with normal deposition, traces of unknown minerals and localized cold spots that persisted even during hot afternoons. The farmer, by now, had stopped sleeping entirely. He would wander the field at night, muttering prayers, eyes scanning the soil as if expecting it to rise and speak. Visitors noted that the ground itself seemed to exhale when he stepped near it. Soft, almost imperceptible, yet undeniably felt. When asked, he only shook his head and whispered, "They won't stay buried." The town's response evolved from fear to obsession. Neighbors began watching the farm from a distance, noting every change, every sound. One evening, a man reported a shadow crossing the field, a thin, elongated figure moving in a way no human could manage, leaving footprints that vanished in mid-soil. Another observed a faint luminous glow hovering over one cluster of bones, flickering like candlelight, though no flame was present. By the end of the third week, the field had become a theater of quiet terror. Visitors came and went, each returning with stories of unease, cold touches, whispers, and fleeting glimpses of shapes that should not exist. The farm itself seemed alive, a slow, deliberate presence shaping the earth around the remains. Even those who arrived skeptical left convinced that the soil remembered every death, every secret, every disturbance. The final discovery before the field was sealed for investigation involved a cluster of bones arranged in a circle. Inside, a stone was placed upright, etched with marks no one could decipher. That night, the wind carried voices that spoke in low tones, neither human nor animal, repeating a single word again and again: "Stay." Those who heard it fled. By the time investigators cataloged every bone and fragment, the farm had become a legend. No explanation satisfied the community. Each incident, each fragment, each whisper reinforced the sense that something beyond understanding had been uncovered. The earth had given up its secrets, and in doing so, had spoken to those brave or foolish enough to listen. The discovery of bones on the Kansas farm did more than disturb the soil. It unsettled the people who lived nearby, forcing them to confront questions they had long avoided. At first, the reaction was practical: concern for the farmer's safety, the integrity of property, and the presence of potential hazards in the soil. Neighbors came cautiously, lingering at the edge of the field, speaking in hushed tones, their eyes darting toward shadows that seemed to shift without cause. Families whose homes were only miles away began to behave as though the farm emitted an invisible influence. Children refused to play near the road leading to the fields, citing voices, shadows, and fleeting shapes that their parents could not see. Mothers whispered warnings that were half superstition, half genuine fear. Even the adults, normally measured and practical, admitted unease. Some claimed to wake in the middle of the night feeling cold drafts that could not be explained. Others spoke of an inexplicable heaviness pressing on the chest when standing near the boundary lines. The local doctor, summoned to examine the remains and assess potential risks, documented reactions with both clinical precision and a reluctant acknowledgement of the uncanny. His notes reveal the tension between scientific reasoning and the inexplicable. He observed that certain soil samples displayed anomalous density, that some bones bore precise cut marks inconsistent with natural decay, and that localized temperature variations around the clusters defied the patterns expected in a rural field. Despite this, he attempted to calm the townspeople, attributing much of the reported sensations, cold spots, whispers, and feelings of being watched, to stress, fear, and the human tendency to project unease onto unfamiliar circumstances. The sheriff, meanwhile, faced practical and moral challenges. Law enforcement at the time was sparse and stretched across miles of farmland. He kept a watch on the property, mostly to prevent curious onlookers from disturbing the fragile remains or tampering with evidence. Yet even he could not deny the stories circulating through the town. Reports of strange lights in the barn, shadows moving where no one could be, and whispers at dusk reached his ears repeatedly. He recorded these accounts cautiously, noting both the reliability and the emotional intensity of the witnesses, without committing to a judgment on their truth. Clergy, too, entered the conversation. Pastors delivered sermons warning of sin and divine retribution, framing the uncovered bones as evidence that man could not trespass on the past without consequence. They spoke of the land itself bearing witness, of souls unquiet and restless, and of the moral responsibilities of those who disturb graves. Parishioners attended in numbers, hoping for guidance or reassurance. But many left with the unsettling feeling that the spiritual presence on the farm was beyond human control. The town newspaper, the Wilson County Sentinel, walked a careful line. Early reports were factual, dry, and devoid of speculation, citing the discovery and the presence of state investigators. Yet letters to the editor and editorial musings revealed deeper tensions. Some columnists urged caution, warning that curiosity might awaken forces best left undisturbed. Others suggested that the bones were the remains of forgotten pioneers, victims of epidemic or accident, and that human imagination had inflated a natural phenomenon into horror. Readers wrote in, sharing stories of their own families' forgotten graves, tales passed down through generations, and accounts of strange occurrences near abandoned homesteads. Beyond newspapers and sermons, psychology and early scientific inquiry began to intersect. Physicians and investigators debated whether the fear experienced by townspeople could be explained by proximity to death, mass suggestion, or stress-induced auditory hallucinations. Certain medical journals of the era referenced similar cases in other rural communities. Isolated farms where human remains were discovered decades after initial settlement, accompanied by reports of auditory or visual anomalies. The Kansas case, however, stood out for the systematic pattern of the bones, the apparent organization within the clusters, and the consistency of witness accounts over several weeks. Even neighboring towns weighed in with speculation, some attributing the discoveries to unsolved crimes from decades prior, others to older, perhaps indigenous burial sites that had been disturbed. Scholars and anthropologists later examined the region, noting the historical presence of Native American tribes, early settler conflicts, and frontier justice that often went undocumented. They considered the possibility that the farm's soil held not only physical remains, but cultural memory, a convergence of past violence, displacement, and neglect. Among the residents, reactions varied. Some families relocated quietly, choosing to leave the area entirely. Others remained, speaking of the bones only in whispers and refraining from work near the field after dusk. Conversations in homes and at general stores increasingly revolved around cautionary tales, stories of travelers who had disappeared near similar sites, warnings to avoid certain fields, and the sense that the land itself had agency. Even routine agricultural work became imbued with a ritualistic precision, fences mended more carefully, crops planted with deliberate spacing, and soil turned with respect for what might lie beneath. Remarkably, despite the fear, there were those drawn to the farm by fascination. Curious observers, students, and journalists visited, documenting each discovery with notebooks, photographs, and sketches. Some were meticulous, recording measurements, soil composition, and the location of bones. Others focused on the reported phenomena, whispers, cold spots, fleeting shadows. Many left the farm shaken, not merely by the physical evidence, but by the sense of being watched, as if the field itself had awareness. The combination of science, folklore, and witness testimony created a unique narrative. It was neither fully supernatural nor entirely explainable. It existed in a liminal space where the rational and the inexplicable coexisted. Residents debated, sometimes fiercely, whether to respect the land's silent claim or to continue probing. Over time, the farm became an unspoken boundary, a place of memory, fear, and reflection, teaching the community about the persistence of the past and the fragility of understanding. In personal letters recovered decades later, townspeople reflected on the psychological impact. One wrote of dreams filled with whispering voices from the soil. Another recounted the persistent sensation of footsteps following them across empty fields. Even the farmer himself, whose life had been irrevocably altered, described a growing sense of isolation, not only from neighbors but from reality itself, as the line between what was buried and what remained alive blurred into something incomprehensible. Ultimately, the reactions of the community illustrate a tension central to rural America at the time. The intersection of progress and memory, science and superstition, life and the inescapable weight of death. The bones were not merely remains. They were catalysts, forcing the living to confront questions about mortality, history, and the unseen forces embedded in the land. Even today, the story resonates, preserved in fragments of newspapers, oral histories, and archival photographs. The silence that followed the removal of the bones was itself a response, a collective acknowledgement of something that exceeded understanding, a recognition that some discoveries cannot be reconciled with daily life. The farm, once ordinary, had become extraordinary in its ability to remind people that history, even when buried, leaves traces, and that the presence of the past can shape both perception and action. By mid-June, the farm had become a place no one approached lightly. The bones uncovered over the preceding weeks had revealed a pattern that defied all expectations, and the air itself seemed to carry an oppressive weight. Those who dared enter reported sensations that bordered on the unbearable. Sudden chills, the faint brush of unseen fingers against their skin, and whispers that rose from the soil without source. Even the wind seemed to bend around the field differently, carrying sounds that mimicked human speech. It was on a particularly overcast evening, just before sunset, that the climactic events began. A small team of investigators, comprising a local sheriff, the town doctor, and a journalist, entered the field to perform a final survey before cataloging and sealing the site. Their approach was cautious, each step calculated, as if the earth might respond to movement itself. The plowed soil was disturbed but carefully sectioned. Bones lay partially exposed, meticulously mapped. Yet as they approached the central cluster, a sense of unease deepened. The first anomaly occurred near the oldest pit. The ground, previously stable, shifted slightly under the team's weight. One investigator swore he saw a faint outline of a hand pressing up through the soil, pale and skeletal, only to vanish the moment anyone moved closer. No one spoke, but the collective silence was punctuated by the low moan of the wind and the creaking of the nearby barn. Then came the sound, a whispering, like 1,000 voices speaking in unison but faintly, almost beneath perception. The team froze, realizing that the voices were neither wind nor animal. They seemed deliberate, organized, forming syllables that might have been language if one strained to listen. The journalist, notebook in hand, noted a rising tension in his chest, as if the field itself were constricting him. The team approached the largest cluster, where a human skull had been placed atop a small mound of bones, surrounded by curved rib fragments. As they knelt to examine the arrangement, the soil shifted again. This time the movement was unmistakable. A small bone rolled, then another, as if nudged by unseen fingers. The shadows lengthened unnaturally, and a thin mist began to rise from the ground. Each investigator felt a sudden drop in temperature, so severe it caused condensation to form on their coats, despite the late afternoon warmth. A sudden sharp cracking sound split the air. The barn's door, previously closed, banged open, swinging violently on its hinges without wind. A single beam of light cut across the field as the overcast clouds parted for a brief moment, illuminating the bones in stark, unforgiving detail. The shadows cast by the fragments seemed to writhe, stretching unnaturally as if trying to escape their physical forms. One of the investigators, trembling, reached down to steady a femur that had shifted. As his hand hovered above the bone, a faint whisper directly spoke his name. The words were clear, deliberate, carrying a weight that made his stomach churn. The other two investigators froze, recognizing the same sensation. The field had turned from passive witness to active participant. It was no longer merely a repository of human remains. It was aware, responsive, alive in a way that could not be quantified. The mist thickened suddenly, obscuring the field entirely. Visibility dropped to a few feet. In the dim gray, shapes began to move, thin, elongated shadows that darted between the tree line and the open soil. Each step the investigators took seemed to echo unnaturally, a delayed resonance that didn't match their movement. Then came the whispers, now louder, forming fragmented sentences that no one could fully decipher. Return. Watch. Never leave. Stay. Panic rose, tempered only by the unspoken agreement to maintain observation. Cameras and notebooks shook in trembling hands, yet no one dared to run. It was as if the land itself demanded their attention. One of the shadows approached the skull cluster, pausing in a way that suggested intent. The temperature plummeted further, frost forming on the exposed bones. A sudden gust of wind carried an acrid scent, like decaying vegetation mixed with iron. Then a sequence of small tremors began underfoot. The soil, layered with bones and roots, heaved slightly as though something beneath stirred. Bones jostled in their shallow graves, forming patterns that mirrored the clusters above. The observers could not explain what they saw. Every instinct screamed for retreat, yet curiosity rooted them in place. It was a confrontation between human rationality and the inexplicable authority of the land itself. In the chaos of the field, the mist parted briefly, revealing an arrangement of bones forming what resembled a distorted human figure. Its limbs were uneven, ribs protruding like fences. The skull tilted unnaturally. Shadows extended from it, connecting to nearby fragments. The effect was hypnotic, an almost ceremonial display that seemed intentional, deliberate and terrifyingly aware of its audience. Voices rose simultaneously, no longer whispers but layered choruses, indistinct yet ominous. Each observer felt a personal weight pressing on them, thoughts intruding unbidden, memories, fears, and regrets surfacing with unnatural clarity. One recalled a long-forgotten childhood fear of the dark, another a moment of shame or loss long buried. The field, it seemed, reached into the mind, extending its dominion beyond the physical. By the time the mist began to dissipate, the farm had delivered its full effect. Bones had shifted once more, leaving new clusters and patterns that defied immediate explanation. Shadows retreated toward the tree line, leaving only an oppressive quiet. The investigators, shaken but intact, stepped back from the central mound. No words were spoken. The silence itself communicated the enormity of what had transpired. Later analysis would reveal the patterns of movement, the frost anomalies, and the minor soil disturbances. Photographs captured indistinct shapes and reflective glimmers on bone surfaces, though nothing conclusively supernatural could be verified. Yet every witness agreed on one point: the farm had communicated. Its message was ineffable and yet unmistakable. When night fell, the land returned to its quiet state. The whispers ceased, though the air remained heavy. The field, scarred by the week's events and strewn with the evidence of both past and present, seemed to breathe softly, as if settling after a long outpouring of memory. Those who had witnessed the climax could not forget the sensation of intentionality, the sense that the bones, the soil, and the mist were aware of their presence and responded to it with precision. The climactic events were never widely reported in newspapers. Local authorities, aware of public hysteria, kept most details private. Only fragmentary accounts, notes in personal diaries, and letters preserved the memory. The farm itself became a place avoided by locals and feared by those who remembered. The climax, in its quiet, harrowing inevitability, illustrated the full power of the land's hidden history. It was not just the bones or the whispers or the mist. It was the sense that the past could confront the present with agency, demanding recognition, reflection, and respect. In that confrontation, the observers found themselves changed, carrying the weight of knowledge that the Kansas soil held secrets beyond human reckoning. The farm, after the climactic events of that summer, returned to a deceptive stillness. Crops grew where bones lay half buried, yet the earth seemed to retain a subtle memory of the disturbances. Locals reported that animals still avoided the property, that winds carried whispers only when the fields were empty, and that even in daylight, the soil felt dense and heavy underfoot. The farmer, whose discovery had set the events in motion, vanished quietly, leaving no record of departure. Some said he left for another state, others whispered that he never left at all, that the land had claimed him in the same way it claimed the bones. Over the years, curiosity drew occasional visitors. Journalists and amateur historians attempted to document the farm's past, combing through archival photographs, letters, and court documents. They reconstructed timelines, mapped the original finds, and interviewed descendants of witnesses. Yet no one could fully explain what had occurred. Each account was consistent in its core. The presence of human remains, the organized clusters, the inexplicable shifts in soil and bone, and the pervasive feeling that the land itself was aware. Beyond that, interpretations diverged into speculation, theory, and myth. Scientific explanations were offered. Some proposed that the soil's unique composition caused differential preservation, creating patterns that seemed intentional. Others cited natural phenomena such as frost heaving or minor seismic activity to account for the movement of bones. Anthropologists noted the historical context. Kansas had been a site of frontier settlement, conflicts, and forgotten burials. They argued that the clustering could reflect cultural practices long obscured by time. Yet these rationalizations failed to capture the visceral reaction reported by observers: the cold, the whispers, the shadows that appeared without source. Local folklore embraced the mystery. The farm became a cautionary tale, passed through generations as both warning and story. Children were told never to enter the fields alone, elders murmured about unseen presences, and travelers were advised to respect the soil and leave quickly if passing after dark. The bones and the events surrounding them became a symbol of the tension between human understanding and the persistence of the past. They reminded the living that the land holds memory, and that memory can endure far beyond the grasp of explanation. Letters from townspeople, preserved in private collections, offer glimpses of long-term psychological effects. Some described recurring dreams of the field, of bones shifting beneath their feet, and of whispers calling them by name. Others spoke of an inability to walk near abandoned farmland without unease. The pattern of fear was subtle, insidious, and persistent. a reflection of the way traumatic discovery can echo across time, affecting perception long after the initial event. The press eventually moved on. World events such as the First World War overshadowed local mysteries, yet the story persisted in oral accounts and local memory. Scholars visiting decades later noted that the precise location of the largest bone clusters was often avoided by residents, and that soil disturbances observed by researchers suggested a continuity of unusual conditions. The land itself had become part of the narrative, a participant in the history it concealed. Speculation persisted about the identity of those whose remains were uncovered. Were they settlers lost to disease, victims of frontier justice, or something older, perhaps linked to forgotten indigenous burials? Anthropologists and historians debated but ultimately acknowledged that some questions could never be answered. The soil had preserved not only bone, but uncertainty, a testament to human limits when confronting the remnants of the past. Even today, the farm carries a reputation among those who study local history. Maps indicate its location, but few visit. Those who do report sensations similar to the original observers: whispers in the wind, shadows at the edge of vision, and the unnerving feeling that one is being watched. Some take photographs. Most leave without words, acknowledging silently that the land remembers. The story's endurance underscores a key reflection. Human understanding is often incomplete. The bones, the soil, the shifting patterns, and the whispers illustrate a principle as old as history itself. The past persists in ways the living cannot fully control. It lingers in the earth, in memory, in perception, shaping experience long after the original events. In Kansas, on that solitary farm, this principle manifested in both tangible and intangible ways, reminding all who encountered it that discovery carries responsibility, and that some truths resist full comprehension. The epilogue of the farm is not one of resolution. There is no final account, no definitive explanation, no closure. The bones remain, whether buried again, preserved by soil, or simply remembered through narrative. The land holds them, and through them, the memory of what occurred. Observers may come and go, interpretations may vary, but the presence persists, a quiet, unyielding reminder that history is never truly gone. In reflection, the events at the farm illustrate the intersection of human curiosity, mortality, and memory. Scientific methods can catalog the physical evidence, and folklore can preserve the stories, but neither can fully replicate the experience of encountering the unknown. The tension between explanation and the ineffable remains at the heart of the mystery, compelling each generation to reconsider what it means to confront the past, buried yet alive beneath the earth. Ultimately, the Kansas farm teaches that some discoveries are not meant to be fully understood. They exist as reminders of the fragility of human perception, the persistence of the land, and the echoes of those who came before. Even a century later, the farm stands as a silent witness to its own history, to the bones uncovered, and to the mysteries that remain unsolved. The field may appear empty at first glance, but beneath the surface lies a narrative that continues to speak to those willing to listen, a testament to the power of the past and the haunting endurance of memory.